right, let's get started. So we're going to cover habits and addictions. So we've talked about habits kind of off and on along the way, and we're going to get a little bit deeper into habits, but we're going to do that mostly to get into a discussion of addictions. And so as we look at habits and addictions, let's get an idea of their definitions. So just as a heads up, we're going to be looking at worry and depression starting next Sunday for 6 classes. So we'll take 3 classes for one and 3 classes for the other, and that'll finish us up. All right.
Hey Dale, just when we had our meeting, there was 2 different ways that we were probably going to go on that. And the number 1 was going to be depression. Remember we said we might just we're going to spend most of our time on depression. Okay. Just sorry that I forgot.
And they may tend to overlap.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, they do definitely.
And the third category is pride, and we talked about that last week. So, all right. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to define some terms, and we're going to look at the 2. We're going to focus on habits for a while. Look at what happens when we transition from a habit to an addiction, and then go into addictions and finish that up Wednesday night. So bring your packets with you on Wednesday nights. I'll have a few extras here if you miss them. But so how do you think addictions apply to self-control? What's the connection?
Well, if you exercise self-control, you typically won't become addicted to something.
Exactly. And if you have an addiction, you typically have a lack of self-control. Mm-hmm. Now, if you have an addiction, and it's because you have a lack of self-control, what's the one main tool you really need to fix and get out of that addiction?
Self-control.
Self-control. It's kind of a catch-22. So it's one of those problems where the reason you have it in the first place is the reason it's going to get worse.
But you have to know who's going to help you with that self-control,
exactly right.
And unfortunately so many people do not avail themselves of that help.
Yes, and that's really the focus of what we're talking about. So, what is that habit? A habit is a learned pattern of behavior, and it's repeated so often that they're just typical of us. We're kind of known for those things. Habits are based on our thinking, so it comes from our mind. Sometimes we do habits kind of subconsciously, but it's still coming from our thinking. It's coming from who we are. It's coming from our heart. Habits can be good and they can be bad, and they can be therefore they can either be helpful or detrimental, and they do have to do with our self-control. Addictions, on the other hand, can they be good?
Not really.
Not really.
Not really.
You can say I'm addicted to something good, and usually, like, let's say you're addicted to teaching others. And what that means is you don't go home and feed your family because you're too busy scheduling meetings with people. Is that a problem? Yep. Yeah, it's a problem. You got to keep a balance. So.
Or you can be too pushy with your teaching.
Sure.
I have to work at that at Kittle. I just want to tell everybody, but doesn't everybody want to listen?
Yeah.
So you have to pick your battles,
Yep.
And if you're compulsive, you can't keep from telling people.
You kind of blurt it out, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes at the wrong moment.
Yeah, and sometimes even wanting to tell people about God is not good if you're gonna,
especially if you're going to
push them the other direction.
So an addiction is a compulsive, enslaving dependency on something resulting in detrimental patterns of thinking and behavior. Substance addictions that come out of that are things like alcohol, tobacco, drugs, inhalants, things like that. Process addictions, which are different than substance, are more like gambling or eating or shopping, sex, things like that. Addictive behavior results in a corrupt way of life. You don't keep things balanced the way you should. It causes us to have self-control problems, and there is something called dual or poly addiction, and that refers to having 2 or more addictions at the same time. Now it is interesting, and we're going to talk about that right now. Addictions, if you have one, you probably have 2. If you have 2, you probably have 3. Why?
If you're prone to that, you're probably going to pick up something else you're going to be addicted to.
Yeah, usually if you have a self-control problem, that's usually going to show itself in having more than one. There are also some things coming that have to do with the underlying conditions or reasons that also shape that. And so things like, especially when you're doing things for a different reason, like they're making you feel better about something, underlying feelings, those can be a real problem. So underlying causes, they make us susceptible to other addictions. So generally, if you've got one, you probably know because you've probably got more than one. So the difference between a common habit and an addiction, I'll just say off the top, I think an addiction is a habit that's gone bad. That might be the best way to define it. It's a habit that's gone bad. You can tell the difference because the amount of time that it takes from our everyday life with an addiction is more than it should. It has some power over our life. It has negative impacts on us. And so that's one way to identify it. An addiction typically puts itself on the throne because now you are kind of bowing to it. And it's providing your source of direction. It's providing you, it's focusing your spiritual life on the addiction. It takes God's power away and gives it to the addiction, and then it provides the impact to our lives instead of God and His Word providing the impact.
That person that has an addiction is going to deny.
Yes, they're the last ones to know, but they shouldn't be. And we're going to talk about some things you can do if you're the one to try to figure out, okay, maybe I do have a problem here. So with anything like this, and this is kind of typical of the 10-step program and or 12-step program and AA and all that, what's the first thing you have to do if you're going to get anywhere? You have to admit you have a problem, right? And if you can't see it, you're in trouble from the beginning because you can't fix it if you don't know you've got it. So we're going to look at a few ways of looking at this. So there are maybe 5 different kinds of habits, 5 different categories. There are good habits, harmless habits, hard habits, hidden habits, and hard habits. So let's look at good. What's the benefit of a good habit?
Healthy, for one thing, a good habit of eating healthy food, not
Okay.
overeating.
So those are, having good habits will make us, will kind of smooth our life out. It will make things more predictable. When people see us and they know we have good habits, we typically are the kind of person that has a very predictable lifestyle.
We won't
Our
have to-
habits
we won't
even,
have-
I'm sorry.
We won't have to work so hard at them.
Yeah,
It's more natural.
it's true. And I think when when things aren't habitual to you, you do have to work harder at it. You have to think more. Now, can we get so habitual that things are very subconscious and we don't think anymore?
Sure.
Yeah, and that's not always bad, but sometimes it is. What would be a situation where not thinking about what you're doing might be a problem?
Maybe your language.
Okay,
I have a friend that tries to watch her language when she's around me, and I appreciate that. But once in a while, she's such in a habit
yeah,
that she will slip. But then she's beginning to catch it, and that's good.
and that's
But when you-
against a bad habit, right?
Yeah, but when you get in the habit, it just comes out.
So
But
now let's
what
say we
if
have
we're
a good habit and we and we're way too subconscious about
I
it.
think prayer falls into this category.
Could,
because-
yes.
You know, you pray at times where it's expected. The family is sitting down for dinner and you whip out a prayer and it doesn't mean a lot to you. One of the things that I respect here with Stan, when he gets up to pray,
Yeah.
he takes a minute and he stops. And it gets everybody focused on what's coming. And then he leads into it in a very respectful way. I like that.
So you're not, the problem is engagement, right? You're not really engaged when you're not thinking about it. You can go help people, and the people are certainly helped. But if you're so disassociated from it that you're just doing it because you're doing it,
It becomes
well,
rote.
it's rote. It doesn't give anybody glory. It's not. You're not doing it for the purpose of God. And so you can get yourself into a position where even good habits can be a problem if you don't at least put some brain power into it. So harmless habits, these are habits that are common to many people, but they usually don't hurt anybody. Sometimes they're innocuous and sometimes they're just irritants. You know the person that always cracks their knuckles and while you know that's probably not good for their knuckles. It's not anything that's gonna cause any long problem for you. But it's one of those things where, okay, if you have situations in your life where things like that tend to control you, maybe that can get out of hand too. So you kind of want to watch those things. Heart habits are habits that are in the heart that isn't right. So those, when the heart's not right, the wrong attitudes and emotions come out. And so when you're in the habit of doing things from a wrong heart, that's when, like you were talking about, where, okay, if you got a problem with language, the more habitual you become with your language, the more problem you're going to have, because it's just going to flow. You're not even going to think about it. But there are also attitudes like envy and jealousy, prejudice, pride, ungratefulness, unforgiveness. So those can be problems as well. Hidden habits. Sometimes these are habits that you don't even recognize you have. They aren't habitual. They aren't regarded as being negative by you, but sometimes they are even good things that you do, like habitually helping other people, apologizing too much, procrastinating too much, shopping too much, spending too much. They can be hidden to you, and that's what kind of Dennis talked about earlier. If we don't know we're doing them, then we're going to have trouble controlling and or fixing them. And then the last one is destructive habits, which is really where we're at with when we hit addictions. So they create a damaging climate for everyone, including the person themselves. They include things like verbal abuse, emotional abuse, drunkenness, divisiveness, vulgarity, violence. These are the kind of things that, when people are like this, that's kind of what we know them for. They're just violent. They always talk back. Their mouth always gets the best of them. I mean, we know these people by what they do, and in some ways we'll say, well, they just can't help themselves. Well, they can.
Yeah.
They just choose not to. Now, many times when you have those kind of problems, you don't even consider them a problem, which just kind of fits back into this hidden habits, and you keep doing them, and until somebody convinces you it's a problem, you're going to keep doing it. So there are positive benefits of habits. So habits can be beneficial. They can be profitable. A habit that we can have that's good for us is when we assemble together every time the doors are open. That's a good habit to get into. In Hebrews 10:25, it talks about those who habitually don't show up when the doors are open. And so that's a habit too, which would be an example of a bad habit. So habits can be good for us. They can put us in a mindset where we do a lot of good things and do a lot of the right things. Habits can be passed down from generation to generation. We saw Jehoshaphat followed the example of King David. And so those things, the examples that are set for us, when we repeat them, they can become habits that get flowed down. Habits can reflect our devotion to God and God's character. So it says in 2 Chronicles that he took great pride in the ways of the Lord. So the fact that he showed that out by his actions and his conduct shows that he was reflecting his devotion in that. And even Jesus, it said he would often slip away to the wilderness to pray. Often slipping away says that was habitual to him. It was something he did often. And he did that because of his devotion, not necessarily to hide from people. I think this next one, habits can increase consistency and strengthen our character. That's kind of the main one we've been talking about. It says in Job that the righteous will hold to his way, and that the person who has clean hands will grow stronger and stronger. That's that consistency that we get by making things habitual. We talked at the very beginning of the class with the processes and the things that we were trying to get all the way to the point of things becoming more habitual, that would make us more predictable. That would increase our consistency, and that's really what we're striving for. So habits are actually a choice. Even though sometimes they seem to be subliminal, they are choices that we make, and we choose to do these. Now, how does a single choice get to become a habit?
By choosing it over and over.
Over and over and over, yeah. It's the repetitiveness of it that causes it to be that way. And so they are a choice that we make. And they are a reflection of our will, because if that was against our will, we might do it once, but we wouldn't keep doing it over and over. So you can really see a lot about a person by what things they make habitual in their lives. You can be a positive witness to others because of just what we've been saying. Your light will shine when they see you doing the right things. And if we do that to the right extent and the full extent, then we'll find ourselves in a better position with God, much more pleasing to Him. So those are very good things, and that's really, when we talked about habits early in the class, this is where we want to get to. But if we're not careful, they can get to the point of becoming an addiction. So what are some negative aspects of habits? Well, they can be evil and they can be destructive. If you have a bad habit, that's going to drive you just as much as a good habit, but in the wrong direction. So in 1 Timothy, there's an example there that the women who weren't working, they learned to be idle, and they would go around from house to house, and they would be gossips and busybodies talking about things that weren't proper. Well, that was a habit they were learning that was detrimental to not only them, but the people that they were around and to the congregation. So that was a problem. And then in Ephesians 2, it talks about the people who formerly walked according to the course of the world. Those were habits that were making them follow the course of the world. So we talked about habits being the result of choices. In this case, they're the result of bad choices. And so if our mechanism for making decisions is broken and we make a lot of bad decisions, we can make a decision over and over, a bad one, and turn that into a habit. So one of the ways to avoid that kind of a habit is to have a better handle on your decision-making processes. Addictions can lead our hearts astray by causing us to follow after sensualities and things that we're not supposed to be doing. Addictions can hold people captive. I think that's probably a very good definition of an addiction. You're captive to it. You can't get loose. You're a prisoner. And that holds you in darkness, which when you're in that scenario, sometimes it's hard to find a way out. You can be enslaved to it. It's got control of you. In 2 Peter 2 verses 17 through 19, right at the end it says, they themselves are slaves of corruption, for by what a man is overcome, by this he's enslaved. So whatever overcomes you is your master. Well, who's the only thing that's supposed to be our master? God. Well, if we're allowing these other things to become our masters, then we're slaves of them, and we've got a problem. And that means they're our master. They hold mastery over us. And since God is supposed to be our only master, and we're supposed to have the attitude that we're not going to let anything master over us. So when we see ourselves with habits that are starting to go bad, or we see ourselves with addictions, should that be a big red flag for us? It should, because immediately we're allowing something else to take control of our lives. Well, we can't let that happen, because we need to be in control of our lives.
And that's when maybe, well, not maybe, we do need our Christian brothers and sisters.
Yes.
We need to, as James said, confess your sins,
Yep.
and get people to pray for you if you're unable to even pray for yourself.
And at the end of each of your packets, I threw some stuff in that we're not going to cover. But there's a set of accountability questions there, and they're in case you got asked to be accountable for someone to help them, or if you needed it. You could give those people those questions, and they'll ask you the hard questions, or you'll ask them the hard questions to help them be accountable. So
Good.
sometimes you can't be accountable on your own. You need someone else to be your conscience for you. Well, that's what those questions are for. So I put those in there, so you'll have those. We're not going to cover them, but I thought they would be useful. So there is hope. We can overcome through Christ, and that's kind of what Nelma said at the beginning, was if we of ourselves can't get out of these messes, but with God's help we can get out of these messes. And so what does God give us to get out of these messes? Several things. He gives us His Word, He promises us His help, and He gives us His people. And so we have all those resources available to us to help us get out of these situations.
And
So,
we've already talked about pride, but we've got to be sure that our pride doesn't get in the way of asking for help if we need
Yeah.
it. And
that's-
sometimes that happens.
It does, and that's a big problem, because usually if we have that problem, we're not gonna get out of the mess. So, it's a catch-22 that buries us deeper and deeper. So how are we gonna identify these harmful habits, maybe even say addictions? How are we gonna find them? Well, there's a list of questions here we can ask ourselves. And these are questions that if we answer yes to them, we might need to stop a little bit and think about them. So identifying harmful habits, are my thoughts consumed with it? Well, that's a clue. If you constantly are thinking about something over and over, you might have a problem with that. Is my time schedule around it? Could my health be harmed? Does my guilt increase because of it? Are my finances affected? Do I get defensive when someone asks about it? And all sorts of questions. Is my spiritual growth hindered? Have I been asked by somebody to stop it? Would I discourage my children from doing it? Do I hide it? Would others avoid doing it? Does it diminish my witness for Christ? So those are all questions. If you go down through those and you're honest with yourself, you should be able to see areas where you might be having some trouble in some areas. And these things might be able to help you figure out why and determine if you've got a problem with that. So in Psalms 139, verses 23 and 24, it says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart." So we want God to search our hearts, but we also need to search our own hearts. And we can ask others to help us with that, with some of these questions. We could even give these questions to someone else and have them ask us. What's the most important thing with these questions when you ask yourself them?
Honesty.
Honesty. Yeah, if we aren't honest with ourselves and we just try to make it look better than it is, we're just continuing that problem and not being able to see anymore. All right, so those are some questions that we can use to help us identify. So how do we develop and demonstrate good habits? And these are 6 areas that would be useful to us. So in the moral sensitivity area, so this is the area where we need to be knowledgeable. So studying the scriptures, consider what it means to have no other gods, measure our behavior against the scriptures. This is having a conscience properly trained, just kind of the way we described it earlier in the class. Accountability, be open to the truth, say with appreciation that when someone does bring it up to you, that you're willing to thank them for bringing it up to you. Think about how the negative attitudes impact your life and the lives of others. Confession to God, talking with a friend who can help you. These are all ways that we can increase our accountability. So gratefulness, why would gratefulness be important for good habits? Well, we might not be willing to give God the credit that He needs for all the gifts that He's given to us. We might not realize how much God has answered our prayers. We need to be able to express gratitude to the people that helped us, and thank God for what He has done for us and for His Word. So there are a lot of things that if we're grateful about what others are doing for us, it will help us to
That scripture
demonstrate
that
that.
says, "Give thanks in all things," is always been a hard one for me,
Yeah,
and I'm
yeah.
sure it is for other people.
Yeah,
I mean, that's not a, if you want to, or maybe so, you do it.
It's a great exercise to keep your frame of mind positive and correct.
It also helps you to really stop and think about what your habits are.
Yes, it
You have
does.
to do some introspection there.
Uh-huh.
And if you're, as you were saying, being honest, right, it's gonna force you to, hopefully, really look at what are your good habits and what are your bad habits.
Yes. Forgiveness is another area where we can use this to help us create better habits. Knowing that forgiving others is required. If we want to be forgiven, that's going to create a reciprocal relationship where we know that it's important to us and our well-being to make sure that others are forgiven. Sometimes we're so angry that we think a person justifiably should be shunned. Forgive them anyway. Ken used to say that if you put acid into a vessel, that's usually the vessel that gets harmed more than what it's being put on. And so the vessel is us. And so when we're angry and upset at people that can harm us way more than them, just remind yourself how many times God has forgiven you, and then realize that forgiveness happens over and over and over. And that just because you've done it once doesn't mean that you've set the bar and you're done with it. Selflessness is probably one of the most important, because that sets a high standard for yourself, but it allows others to have their standards. Sometimes you need to ask God to expose your selfishness, because sometimes selfish people usually don't even know they're being selfish, because it's all about them. And actually when they're feeling best about themselves is when they're getting their selfishness taken care of. And so it's a bad problem that helps. It actually keeps itself going. So avoid talking about yourself, avoid bragging about things, encourage others to talk, listen, praise others for the characteristics and qualities that they have, resist the urge to criticize them. Sometimes we give advice when it wasn't asked for. Sometimes that's appropriate, sometimes it's not. Usually you can tell by the reaction, and you need to be responsive to that reaction. If they immediately start getting their resistance up, then you might need to back off a little bit. And then it's always a good exercise to perform unsolicited acts of kindness. We talked about this before, but if you go over to somebody, let's say we go over to help one of the widows and take care of some things they need to have done in their house, who's really benefited by that? Usually the people that do the work are more benefited than the person who got the work. And so unsolicited acts of kindness are more helpful to us than they are other people. And then spending time with God, communing with Him, spending your time alone with God every day, removing distractions, putting your focus on Him, and then have a quiet spirit in that. I think a lot of times having a quiet spirit is the answer to a lot of things, because that means you're content. It means that you're satisfied. It means that things are well with you. And so we need to have a quiet spirit, but in the way of God's will. So these kind of things kind of say that we need to know God's will. We need to submit to His will. We need to have better relationships with God. We need to have better relationships with our fellow man. And we need to be able to control ourselves. We need to be able to deny ourselves. We need to have all the self-denial, self-controls, self-consciousness, self-examinations, all the things that we talked about are really important in this area. Well, how do we get from the point of, and I threw this one in because I think this is maybe one of the more important, contentment. When we're not content with things, when things are up broiling within us, nothing good happens. And so Paul says, learn to be content with everything. And when you're that way, then you can be very useful to yourself and to others. So let's talk about transitioning from habits to addictions. Well, these are some attitudes that we have that kind of go in order. So you as a person may have inclinations. And an inclination would be, I tend to be like this. I'm inclined to do these kinds of things. Impulses, they're very quick. They're usually not thought out very well. They're reactions usually. They're spontaneous. And they cause us to act impetuously. With that kind of a reaction, usually our decision making doesn't get kicked in until later, when we finally realize what a mess we've made. Habits then are where we're actually controlling these things, and we have a pattern established. So now we get to obsession. An obsession is a persistent, disturbing preoccupation with an unreasonable idea. Why do we do these things?
Because we're not intense.
It doesn't seem so unreasonable to us, does it? It usually seems like the right thing to do. And so, and it gets intense and we're in the heat of the battle and we don't look up. Compulsion is similar to that. It's just an irresistible, irrational impulse. So instead of it being kind of an inclination, this is an impulse. And it causes us to act against our will. And then we finally get to addiction, which is our compulsive, overpowering dependence on an object or an action, or a feeling resulting in major life problems. So we tend to go in these orders till we're finally down here at the addiction where now we're in so deep we have a hard time getting out. So what are the signs that habits have become addictions? So these are another set of questions that we can ask ourselves. How would we know that habits became addictions? Have I stopped it only to start it again? Am I abnormally preoccupied? Do I do it even though it's got negative consequences? Am I doing it more and more over time to get the same experience as before? Does it change my mood or comfort mood? Do I do it even though it's harmful? Do I hide it from others? Do I neglect relationships? Have I considered getting help? Have I experienced problems at work or at church or anywhere else because of it? These are all red flags for having problems. What is an addictive personality? It's not the one that we feel compelled to go toward. It's if we have an addictive personality, we generally have a propensity to get addicted to things. So some counselors would say that you might have a genetic or psychological influence that makes you vulnerable to these things. You might just have a problem with self-control where you're susceptible to all these things. But you generally have an inability or a reluctance to exercise self-control. So this again is if you have these things and you can't identify them, then you can't fix them. All right, so let's look at the first part of addiction. So we've looked at habits, we've looked at kind of transitioning from a habit over to an addiction, and now we're going to look at addiction. So addictions actually start with habits, and so this is a pretty good description of an addiction. They occur with regularity, they happen without thinking, they outwardly reflect inner morals and character, they grow stronger and more ingrained with repetition, they persist and become hard to change over time, they're purposeful and provide a degree of pleasure. Usually that satisfying part of it is what keeps us going. That's usually, and there's usually a reason why we're doing these things. And the problem is many times we don't know what that reason is. So let's say we overeat. Why do we eat in the first place?
Well, it should be for the fuel.
It's biological, right?
Right.
It should be purely a biological,
Right.
you know, energy in, energy out, let's balance this out and make it all work. Is that why we eat? Well, it should be. Is that how we eat? Is that where we eat? Is that what we eat? No. Is there a relationship? Probably for most of us, it's just a very light relationship, right? We don't think about that when we're eating. Well, I just need, 128 calories or 1,500 calories, and you count them out and you eat them and you're done. What do we do a lot of times when we eat?
Eat till we're satisfied.
Yeah, and that's satisfying is hard to measure because usually that means our stomach hurt so bad we had to stop. A lot of times it's taste, right? We taste things and we like the taste, so we eat more and more and more and more. Some other reasons, and my sister's like this, we eat because we're depressed. Well, why are we depressed? Because we're overweight. Well, why are we eating then? Because now we're just making it worse. A lot of people eat for social reasons. We get together, we eat. Well, that's such a fun activity that now I eat by myself like that. Well, we don't always do things because of the reason that they're to be done. We do them for the sense of pleasure that we get from them. There's some other reason for it. And usually when we have something going out of control, it's not the thing itself that's the problem, it's something else. Something has caused us to use this as a way of kind of substituting another kind of pleasure for the pleasure we're missing in that area. So what categorizes people that are controlled by addictions? Well, you can see they have multiple bad habits. They usually will have multiple addictions. They don't obey the law, they don't obey those in authority. They think their addictions resolve their problems and give them peace. They don't keep their bodies pure or treat them with respect, and they don't practice self-denial, self-discipline, self-control. When you're speaking to an addict, what can you be pretty sure they're not going to do? They're not going to listen, and they're not going to understand, and they're going to pretty much assume you don't understand, because they feel like whatever they're doing is solving their problem. We know better, we know it's not, but they don't.
But sometimes they try to turn it back on you.
They will.
Instead of accepting the,
So I call that nonlinear behavior.
Yeah.
There's no relationship between what you're trying to do and what's coming back at you. And so they're not gonna listen. And in fact, sometimes they're actually dangerous because you're threatening this satisfaction they're getting. And once you threaten that, when that's the only thing that's giving them any peace in this world, they might come at you. And so they don't think clearly, they're not in control of themselves. And so addicts can be very difficult to deal with, and sometimes you have to be, in fact, even careful that you don't set them off or do something that you might be in danger. We actually got halfway through, so we're poised to do the second half for Wednesday night. So bring back your packets with you on Wednesday. We'll finish up with this whole section on addiction.